Hello, Father Obito here. Greetings from the land of Jesus. I'm here to explore more about Jerusalem. So please join me, and I have more videos to come. Mabuhay. God bless you, and muchas gracias. Dios les bendiga a todos. Good morning to all of you. We are here in the beautiful spot. Here, the name of the place is Viet Hatsofe Lookout. And I'll show you this beautiful place. It's a beautiful day. Enjoy.
Just beyond that southern ridge, by the way, is Taltur. So you're just in that general direction. Let's see, what else can we do out here? I will make reference later on in the story as we progress through the historical timeline of what we call the Western Hill of Jerusalem, which is that hill that we see up on high there. So when I mentioned the Western Hill, you have to sort of take a mental image of that area, that ridge up there. You can see there's a very large church structure at the top. That was the Mission Abbey, a German Catholic church. You might be familiar with it. Today we refer to that little ridge just outside the walls of this one as Mount Zion, which also has a bit of a history to it as a name. Of course, Zion is this little reference to the idea of Jerusalem, not limited to the hill, but nonetheless, Zion, and that will be the Western Hill that we'll talk about in a minute. Maybe one also. Yeah, that was perfect because I was literally just about to say, as you read my mind, that as we now sort of explore the earliest archaeological sites in Jerusalem, we're going to progress through the story, and as we do, not surprisingly, we're going to sort of find our way going uphill, right? We're going to go up and up and up and up and up, and eventually we're going to get to another archaeological park on the other side of the street, which is right there in front of us, and that's what I mentioned called the southern excavation. The southern edge of the temple for the main sanctuary for the church, and so that's where we're going to later this correct. Yeah, anything having to do with David would have happened in here, because when David was around, that was not wasn't there yet either. All right, so hold on. Let me go back to this page just so we get so I just want to share just a little bit of an artistic rendering, if you will, of the ancient city of Jerusalem. Okay? This is not scientific. Obviously, the hill will stick out a little bit more. There's a city on the hill. Not an evergreen. That tree is just at the edge. actually comes out of the dome bridge going in a little bit over the shore. And then you can see over here the wall of the city, right? Coming down is a sort of no longer visible valley. Valley, and that was the western border. And from where we're standing, you got three entire city. The length of the river is somewhere around here. We're not representing here how far the city went.
הגבולות האלה שככה נתן עשה לנו עם הידיים, יש לנו כאן את הנחל הזה שנמצא כאן מתחתנו. בעבר הוא היה
where it meets both the Tyrolean Valley and the further western valley, the Hinnom Valley, that I mentioned on the bus on our last time together. Remember when we were driving back to Argentina, right? Which is just on the other side of Mount Zion. Right? So where the valley meets is actually right down there. And that was the southern extension. So it was very, very skinny, not terribly long, and therefore did not have probably a lot of people, infrastructure, and whatnot, which reminds us a couple of things. First and foremost, right, that it probably wasn't the most obvious choice where he would choose to
מה זה? נכון, מה זה? אוקיי, קיבלת? לא. אז זה קודם כל, זה בעצם קיבלת הכסף, זה הלכת, נסגרת לך בצורה הביתה. איך קוראים לכל הארץ? מה אנחנו לא רואים מפה? חברים, מה אנחנו לא רואים מכאן? א', פה אתם קודם כל
we understand why does God need to show Abraham? Because otherwise, Abraham never in his right mind would have ended up here. Because it's the least obvious place to be. Right? But only if you're here because of a God relationship, a God narrative, that's what's going to draw you to a rather unsuspecting, teeny little city on a hill that is clearly dominated by the rest of the landscape. Right? That's where you follow God to a place like that. You do not trust your senses. You do not use logic or reason. Right? That is really the kind of the basis of the narrative. So that's what we can sort of glean from this. I mean, literally in the space that we just kind of delineated, you probably couldn't fit more than 1,000 people. It would be kind of tough, I think. I mean, you squish them in, right? It's not a very big hill. You can see for yourselves. It's just not a lot of space. So yeah, not a dominant city. Perhaps why the only historical reference to the Jebusites who were here before the Israelites is in fact the Hebrew Bible. Right? None of the Egyptian texts, none of the others. We don't know anything about the Jebusites, probably because they were not a very influential culture, because they lived in Jerusalem. Right? You want to be influential, you live near the sea, you live near the Nile Delta, you live in Mesopotamia. That's how you be influential. Right? Again, elevating our version of the story, because that's why you will come to Jerusalem. Because that's our story. So that should be enough to get us started. As I said, most of the rest of our experience in this space.
אתה מוצא אבן, אתה מוצא פרסים, אתה מוצא כל מיני דברים, והוא נותן לך השערה די מדויקת שממתי, הרי מה מוצאים בעיקר בארכיאולוגיה? אמרת טרס, מה מוצאים?
We'll start heading down, and we're looking for a secret.
Well aware. Good luck. let's see, what do we need now? Maps. Do yourselves a favor, try to sort of be under the shade as much as you can. How close are you? How well do you all get along?
I think cozy in the opposite taxes.
To, shall we say, take a leap of faith and assume that even though archaeology isn't really helping us out much, that our story does actually play out, right? We kind of need to assume that, certainly if we're going to kind of continue our relationship with the text, right? We need to know that everything that happens later than, let's say, David and Solomon, is actually based on something and didn't just come out of thin air, although, as I just shared with you, there are now many archaeologists and many people in our various faith communities who have sort of, succumbed to that, or just sort of said, okay, so maybe I'll go with that, that path instead. Just maybe admitting we don't know if those people were here or not. You remember this map that we looked at together when we were at the Kennedy Memorial? We talked about sort of at least God's plan of the tribal allocations, and that as those tribes tried to sort of exact this plan, some of it worked out, some of it not so much. Specifically in the hill country, the Israelites were able to sort of conquer much of the Canaanite territory, but then as they move towards the coastal plain, as they move a little bit further to the north, less clear about their ability to conquer and to settle the land. And so as we kind of enter into this moment of David, right, and the story that we just read from 2 Samuel chapter 5, we're sort of looking at a situation that kind of played out a little bit more like this. Please remember that none of these drawings are scientific. Just want to be very clear about that. Meaning that the area that may have been intended for conquest and settlement by the Israelites was kind of confined to this sort of white little bubble that you see in the center. Those were the areas that the Israelites, at least according to the text, successfully dominated, whereas a lot of the gray area around it, right, and all the other lands, obviously, were areas that the Israelites were not so successful in conquering and therefore had to figure out a relationship with those various local tribes. I gave you the example of the tribe of Dan, right, that was meant to come out to the coastal plain, right, around here, were not very successful and ended up relocating up here in the northern tippy top of the tribal territories, okay? So as we now see David come into the picture, David, again, according to the biblical text, is going to be very successful in essentially redefining the nature of the Israelite experience. All through the wilderness, all through the Torah, all through the early years of conquering and settling this land, the Israelites are defined by their tribal identities, right? That's pretty clear in the text. What is David going to try to do that really Saul had been given the task of, but let's be honest, he wasn't 100% successful? He's going to try to unite the tribes, right? That's why we're going to call it a kingdom. And we're going to very much erase a lot of those tribal boundaries, both in terms of geography, but also in terms of identity, right? And so David is going to unite the tribes by being a strong and stable leader. He is going to establish relationships with many of the other communities in the area. How does that often happen in ancient times? How does a king form a bond with another king? You marry the daughters, right? So David has lots of wives because he has lots of royal relationships that he needs to keep up. David is going to establish then an economy of trade with many of these other territories because he's not at war with them, right? So he's going to stabilize the economy. He is going to bring together the Israelites, perhaps, by sort of allowing them to see him as their unified leader with a power base in Jerusalem. Right? That may, in fact, of course, the Bible doesn't bother to tell us, but that may, in fact, be rooted in the power of the narrative, right? That whole Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob thing happening perhaps on this very hill. So David, there's a reason why David is one of the most well-known and inspiring biblical characters, because he accomplished a lot. There is one thing that David really, really wanted to do, though, that he wasn't able to do. What was that? Build the temple, right? David apparently was a bit of a philanderer. He had a flaw. He got himself into a bit of trouble with God and with the prophet Nathan. And so he was not allowed to build the house of God. What he does do, though, is he purchases the threshing floor, perhaps atop the hill, right, just beyond the area of the palace, from Ravna, who was noted in the biblical text, a Jebusite. Right? Meaning that even though the Israelites had conquered this whole town, apparently there were Jebusites still living here. Because David goes there and purchases that space. Why? Because David believes that that's the ancestral God space that needs to be prepared to build the house of the Lord. Right? That is left to his son Solomon. Ironically, the product of David and Bathsheba, the woman with whom he had this illicit relationship. Okay? So, everybody following so far, right? Again, none of this is anchored in the archaeology, but it's the way the story plays out. And now we need to sort of move into the next period where we do start to see archaeological bases, but we need to understand something important about that transition. Because a lot of our evidence, ironically, is not going to be coming just from this land, but from other lands, other peoples who are now going to start to talk about the Israelites. Why are they going to talk about the Israelites? Because they're going to have interactions with them, and not always the nicest ones. So let's figure out how we make that transition. So we have David to Solomon, right? Solomon then kind of completes the puzzle that his father David started by finishing that last piece, really the definitive moment of building the temple on top of that hill in Jerusalem, right? At that point, it kind of feels like much of the buildup of the story has been resolved, right? That whole process of coming out of the wilderness and settling the land, you've kind of done it all, which means only one thing can happen next. It all falls apart, right? You're at the top of the heap. There's only one direction you can go, and that is down. And so what happens? We learn that with Solomon as king, and certainly his father David before him, one of the ways that Israel becomes a strong and powerful influence in the region is through money, right? You build up an infrastructure, you build up an army, you show your strength through economic trade. Where's all that money coming from? Same as today. Taxes. It comes from you, the little people, right? Some people are happy paying taxes if they see the results. Sometimes if you don't see the results as often or as closely, you may not be so happy about paying those taxes. And so we read that with Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam takes over the kingship in Jerusalem, and many of the people who are farthest from Jerusalem, specifically in the northern territories, right, up here, they come to Solomon's son and say, this is a heavy burden. We cannot bear this burden, right? Remember that a lot of the money is going right back into Jerusalem, the political establishment, the temple. And if you live all the way up here, how often are you seeing all that? Specifically, how often? Remember from our text in Deuteronomy? 3 times a year. And that's if you're a good Jew, right? Meaning that wasn't an easy task to get up off your butt and walk to Jerusalem 3 times a year. So it's quite possible that many Israelites were not even doing it that many times. But at most, you were seeing your capital, Jerusalem, with all of its glory 3 times a year. Otherwise, your taxes are going somewhere you can't see.
Wasn't it a 70-mile radius that they had to come in? And if they were outside of that, they didn't have to come?
I am not familiar with that, but I would love. What's the source of that? Do you know?
It's something I learned along the way.
I mean, that could be something that I don't know. I would love to learn. So figure that out and let me know, because that's very intriguing. What we can say is that we know from our textual story what is perhaps another answer to not seeing Jerusalem and your tax dollars at work. What could you do instead? That did happen in the Bible. Yeah. Well, first, make your own altar, right? That could be seen as a real problem from a monotheistic point of view. But then you could just make your own kingdom. Pay taxes to yourself. And that's precisely what happens. Solomon's son Rehoboam says, no, I will not lighten the burden. All of that money needs to be paid, to keep up the story. And essentially what happens, we see a break in the United Kingdom of Israel. It only lasted for 3 generations, Saul, David, and Solomon, or 2 really, if depending on how you count Saul. And then with the death of Solomon and his son rising to power, we now have 2 kingdoms, one rooted in the Davidic world of Judah, and so it retakes the tribal name of Judah, and the other one to the north is going to call itself Israel, using the more kind of global name of the Israelites, i.e. the children of Jacob, right, who gets that other name. So we now have 2 kingdoms, same narrative, same monotheistic faith traditions, same almost everything, just 2 political entities. And this is where the transition becomes important, because what are all the neighbors now going to think as they witness the split in the Israelite Empire?
They can do it.
They can what?
They can do it.
They can do what?
Divide.
They can
build their own
divide?
kingdom.
Oh, they could think that, but more so, yeah, now's a good time to attack, right? There's no sense of unity. There's no sense of strength. They're fighting amongst themselves. Now we move in. Let's try to take some land as we march around, the Middle East. And so that's exactly what happens. By the time we get to the 8th century, we see the great empire of Assyria, based in the northeast, right? Where does their strength come from? What natural element gives them power? Water, right? Water provides crops and money and trade and everything. Water there in Mesopotamia. So the Assyrian Empire essentially is going to try to make their way to Egypt. Who's on the way? These 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And in the year 722, the Assyrian kingdom will completely decimate the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, this is documented in the biblical text, and it is also apparent according to archaeological texts. Question?
The temple in the north of Israel, Bethel, where is that?
So we're not, so Bethel wasn't a temple. It was where the Ark of the Covenant rested. It was not officially the temple.
Is there a temple in the north?
It is just north of Jerusalem. Bethel, according to our best calculations, is just north of Jerusalem. Today we have a modern day Jewish community called Bethel, but we're not sure if it's in the right place. Bethel is often associated with the Palestinian city of Ramallah, if you're familiar with that, also just north of Jerusalem.
Where was the temple then in Israel?
There was what?
Where was the temple of Israel?
Mount
is in the
Gerizim.
divided kingdom.
Oh, so the only temple was in Jerusalem. There was the Ark of the Covenant that was used as a place of pilgrimage and worship, but it wasn't built as a temple. Just to differentiate, the structure that was built in Jerusalem was relatively unique. The Ark of the Covenant that wandered between, Mount Gerizim was I'm totally blanking on the name that I want to connect to that place for now, but there was also Shiloh, which we talked about last week. Yeah. Oh, are you talking about the later temple?
Well, you're talking about a divided kingdom, so there was a place of worship in the northern kingdom.
Yes, there were two. There were two, one on each border, right? Because it was not just religion, it was also politics. You were basically saying, when you leave our territory and go south, you need to, pay homage to our version of God. So there was a temple on the southern border, and then the temple on the northern border, here, going back to our map. Sorry, I was getting confused with which time period you were in, right? So here you have Jerusalem, the border between the split, here, I'll just use this one. Here's the split between the two. You can see Bethel on the southern border and Dan on the northern border. right? So there were two altars. I don't know if we can call them temples, but they were definitely altars. And it was a way of politically distinguishing your monotheism from your cousin's monotheism in the south. So yeah, that's right, that happened as well. But that happened after, obviously, the split. So where were we? Yes, in terms of the political conquest, the military conquest, in the year 722, the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom of Israel, basically wiping it out. We don't know what happens to most of those people, which is why you might be familiar with the term, the lost 10 tribes of Israel, right? Because we don't know where they went, largely because, we often forget this, our Hebrew Bible is a Judean document. Meaning the people who are writing the biblical text aren't living in the north. They don't know what's going on up there. So they don't know where these people ended up. Maybe they died in battle. Maybe they fled and moved into another country. Maybe they assimilated into the Assyrian culture that took them over. Maybe they became slaves. We simply don't know. And so there's been all of these wonderful, fascinating tales of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, especially starting in, let's say, the 19th century, when all of a sudden people start finding these lost tribes of Israel, right? That's a whole different story. We won't go there for now. What did I want to say? Two things. First of all, I promised to show you this, which comes to us from this historical moment in the city of Dan. And you might, I don't know if you're going there as an excursion. Does anybody know?
I think so.
You're going to Dan? So I may be stepping on somebody's toes here. So don't tell them I told you this. You can you can look very wise when they ask you the question, because you'll know. This stone was found at Dan, and it is part of an inscription, as you can see, in Aramaic, referencing one of the battles that took place between the outside forces and the Israelites. This was written by the non-Israelites. And as they kind of narrate their experience fighting the Israelites, they make mention of one of the kings that they defeated. And he is noted as, let me find it. He is of Beit Daud, or Beit David, which means, not the son, that's Ben, house, Beit David, house of David. Meaning they conquered a king who was well known as being from the lineage of David. This is the first and earliest discovery of an archaeological piece that attests to the existence of David. But here comes the catch question. Does it prove the existence of David? No, of course not. It simply acknowledges that there was a human being 2,700 years ago who stood up and said, I am a great grandson of David. And that's why I'm king. So it's really good, but it's not what we're looking for. But nonetheless, a very, very important piece that we will probably see in the Israel Museum when we go on Thursday together. How come you don't clap for me? I'm just kidding, do not clap. Okay, so that comes from around the same time period. Again, a fascinating find, very important to history, but doesn't quite fill the gap that we're looking to fill. Okay, last thing, and then we're going to move on as well, and that is, so how do we now make